Hi, I'm Khushboo Razdan, and this is Foreign Correspondents Talk Series 2024, an initiative by the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents USA, where we invite members of the foreign press community to talk about their journey as international journalists. And today I have with me New York-based Dutch journalist Lennart Zandbergen. Hi, Lennart. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, good morning. Good to see you.
Good morning. Yeah, good to see you as well. So I'm going to start right away because you are somebody, who covers a beat that I've never interviewed somebody who covers a beat like that. You cover technology from the prism of geopolitics and financial markets. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's actually a pretty broad spectrum of things I cover. It's usually, well, in general, it's US business. And of course, well, technology comes into that a lot. And of course, international relations and trade relations come into that a lot as well. So it's a pretty fun beat.
So do you cover like a because you're from the Netherlands? So is it net EU and the US, or does it also involve like China? And we're seeing a lot of tariffs and trade war going on between US and China, and EU has also come into the fray with dealing with Chinese overcapacity, or the government subsidies that Chinese companies get. Do you also cover all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a very big story we had last year was, of course, the semiconductor trade restrictions that the US placed on, actually also a Dutch company called ASML,
Mm-hmm.
together with some Japanese companies. And I think that is a very good example of where all of this intertwines, right? So it could be that the US finds that they should, well, take these measures, but then it's with China, and then they also need, of course, some European countries as well to participate in that, because otherwise it wouldn't be effective.
Yeah, ASML is quite big, and it's the only company that actually manufactures the latest high technology equipments that are actually used to make semiconductors, right?
Yes, absolutely. That's it.
Okay, so I'll go to that later on, but first I want to know, why did you decide to be a journalist? And this beat, was it, I speak to a lot of journalists, especially foreign journalists, and they're like, oh, this was by accident. This just happened to me. What is your story? Financial markets, technology, geopolitics, how did that happen?
So I guess that goes back pretty far. So I'm 29. So I guess throughout my life, it's always been the case that, well, we've had 9/11, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, then the financial crisis. Those were things that, well, I grew up with seeing that on TV and reading about that in the newspaper when I was young. And well, I've always wanted to know everything about that. And certainly with the financial crisis, I really wanted to know what is happening here and how could this all happen. And so that's what really got me into financial journalism specifically.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I've always been interested in writing, always been interested in reading the news. And well, I ended up by accident actually at a newspaper. It's called Financieel Dagblad in Dutch, or the Dutch Financial Daily. And well, actually, I also came here by accident, and the accident was that I applied when this position opened up as a US correspondent. And I actually thought, well, if I try to apply right now, then maybe in a couple of years another post will open up, and then they will remember that I applied a few years before as well, because I never thought that I would get this job. But well, I did, and I'm happy I did. So yeah, it's really, being in the US is really in the place where most of the developments you see, certainly in financial markets, uh, and well, in economic news in general, it's where it happens. It's where most of the developments come from. If you want to understand how the Netherlands financial system works, for a lot of things you have to go back to the US, where, for example, things like private equity happened way before. So it's good to be here and to try and get a more firm understanding, and to try and explain developments in the Netherlands as well through that way.
Does staying in New York so close to Wall Street also helps?
Yeah, it helps in the sense that, well, of course, there's a lot of conferences going on here. There's a lot of access actually to, that is something that actually quite surprised me, but also the bigger American banks, well, they really want to explain what they're doing also to journalists from Europe. So it really helps to be here and to have access to that. Yeah, absolutely.
So, what are some of the noteworthy developments in the new, in the recent past that you think are really noteworthy and can have a bigger impact in the near future?
Well, of course, I guess the biggest story is the Federal Reserve and when it will lower its policy rate.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people in the financial world were very surprised. Well, that everyone kind of expected a year ago, everyone expected this rate change to have already happened. But of course, well, the US economy is doing pretty well and it hasn't happened yet. And yeah, and it's a story that on the one hand is very technical and it's difficult to grasp what all of this means, like a policy rate, what does that do? But on the other hand, well, most people have a mortgage or a car loan or stuff like that. So everyone feels the effects of all of this. So that makes it very tangible. And well, looking at it from a European perspective, it's also a case of well, contrasting and comparing it with what the European Central Bank is doing, which isn't always on the exact same path as the Federal Reserve. So yeah, you can compare and contrast a little bit like that. That's makes it interesting.
And how does the intersection of technology impact all this, the developments in the financial market? The tech stocks are, I think, doing really well in recent past have done really well. How does that impact
Absolutely.
global markets, and how does it impact a common person like me? Does it?
Well, that's a good question. I think, well, artificial intelligence is the big thing, of course. I think, well, I came to the US beginning of last year. And well, this was almost immediately, this was the biggest story to cover. So I've been following that quite well. And it's, yeah, it's interesting to see as well here how policy is going to have an impact on this. It's interesting to see what the impact will be on the demand for well the semiconductor industry, which we've seen with Nvidia, for example.
Mhm.
And then there is also I think, and that's actually a bigger story even than AI, is this realization that both Europe and the US have had that it isn't such a good idea to be very dependent on other countries for semiconductors. And that is, I think, a realization that came in the past, well, actually in the past 3 or 4 years, is that, well, we need to have these, or at least some of the supply chain in our own countries. And well, again, the US is doing this with this CHIPS Act, putting in a lot of money. It's actually, well, a few weeks ago, I went to visit a few of these factories or to see how these communities are impacted by these investments. And that's, I think, a very important story. The EU does that quite differently. It's more local, I guess, and more on a country level. And yeah, just seeing how that will develop and how we will be maybe both in the US and in Europe less dependent on Asian countries for that is a big development, I think.
Again, I wanted to ask, like, you cover these big technology financial markets. It's kind of like intersection of all of this, but geopolitics is also in the mix. So when you cover these stories, do you feel like these global superpowers who are trying to be kind of self-reliant and not dependent on each other, but there are areas such as AI where they can actually collaborate in a sense, because it's not just about these bigger countries. This is also about, say, countries in the global south, which may or may not have the latest technology right now. And also kind of like the EU's role kind of stuck in between all of this geopolitical tension between China and the US. So how do you see all of those developments? Because this is not just about China and the US, it's also about countries surrounding them and in between them, just like the European countries as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what makes it difficult in Europe is, of course, the amount of countries, and well, they all have different problems and they see things differently. They have different kinds of governments. We've seen that this with Hungary quite a bit, but also, for example, Germany is a lot more friendly with China than some other countries, for example. But what you see in general, I think, is that the European Commission has been a big factor in regulating tech companies. Um, and what you see then is that a lot of other jurisdictions try to follow the European laws because, well, it's this big market that already thought of this way of doing it, and it's not so difficult for these companies to adapt to that in other jurisdictions. So I think what you see also in a country like India or in African countries is that these European laws are often followed, or it's the companies themselves that choose to, well, adapt to the European regulation throughout the globe. So I think if you have an iPhone, well, the newest iPhones all have these USB-C adapters, and that's a very practical and maybe a little bit smaller example of how EU regulation has quite a lot of influence. And I think with AI, well, they've been trying to do the same thing where the EU comes up with a certain set of regulations, sometimes even faster than what the US is doing. And then it's a way of seeing, well, which one works better, and there is a lot of adaptation there as well, I think.
I cannot, not ask you this. President Xi Jinping was recently in Europe. We also see the German Chancellor who visited China recently. There's a lot of talk about electric vehicles. President Biden has imposed, heavy tariffs just recently on Chinese EVs, but we know that there are not many Chinese EVs in the US as well. But there are a lot in Europe. There's a big market for Chinese electric vehicles in Europe. How do you see the Europe kind of like uh, not imitating the US, but also trying to be safe? Is EU doing anything to try of like match the US in terms of policies towards electric vehicles in coming from China? Because you are more exposed to whatever the perceived threats we are talking about in the US.
Yeah, maybe that's true. Well, I think what is the case in Europe is that there is more of this clash between, on the one hand, Europe is very busy with trying to electrify all the vehicles. I think the goal still is to have in 2030 to not sell any gas or diesel powered vehicles anymore. So that means that we need a lot of electric cars, and where the US is more choosing to be more protective of its own industry, and also, well, espionage is an argument that has been used. All these electric cars have a lot of cameras, so they could be used to spy. And in Europe, well, that is less of a discussion point because everyone is so focused on this green energy and making sure that we're not as dependent anymore on a country like Russia for our energy needs as we were in the past.
So Europe is choosing the lesser evil, and and they're less concerned about the perceived threats about espionage. And yeah, because there's a lot of Gina Raimondo, I think last week, said that there are a lot of Tesla vehicles that cannot go to certain properties in China, and we're trying to
Yeah.
think of reciprocity ideas. So that's definitely there. Also, I wanted to talk to you. In your profile, I see that you were also covering economy of sports. What was that like, and how do you explain it? What was that? Was it like long back, or was it like on the sides?
Well, it's on the one hand, and I think that is a great thing about being a correspondent, is that there is a lot of stories to be told from the US, right? And sports, of course, is a big business as well in the US. And I think, well, what you tend to see here is that sports are in a lot of ways more professional than in the US than what we see in Europe. If you look at how American football teams are managed, and you compare that to how many uh, football teams or soccer teams, I should say, here are managed, well, there is a huge difference. And what you then also see is that American investors are getting a lot of profits out of these sports franchises here in the US. And well, Europe has all these very charming soccer competitions, but most of these teams have big debts, and there's not a lot of money going out of that except for the biggest competitions. And now you see American investors going into that. So you see at the very small level, Ryan Reynolds going into Wrexham, a small team in Wales.
Mhm.
You see the Glazer family, who've been the owners of Manchester United for quite a while, and you can see how sometimes there is this conflict because, well, these Americans come in with these expectations of how sports are managed in the US, and then in Europe everything turns out to be quite different. But on the other hand, uh, I think a lot of these European teams also realize, well, we need to change some things because the way sports are managed right now, it's not very sustainable.
Mhm.
So, and of course, I like sports. I like watching sports. So it's kind of this hobby project that you can do on the side, but it's also a very relevant market, and I think a lot of people follow it. So, yeah, it's a good thing to follow, I think.
That's very interesting. My last question to you before, what are some of the key indicators, economic indicators that we should look, we should keenly watch in the coming future?
Well, I think the most important one, and that is one that has been surprising financial markets in the past few years, is this uh, the amount of people that have a job in the US. So right now there is 158 million people working in the US, um, and that is a number that has grown over the past few years at a very high rate. We've seen a lot of months where there will be 300,000 or 400,000 people that are added to the workforce. If you look at it, 3 years ago, there were 16 million jobs less than that there are now. So this is really the big story, I think, in the US, is where this country really manages to attract people to its workforce. And well, that is, I think, the big reason why the economy has been doing so well, because well, all these new people with a new job, well, they get a lot more money to spend. So yeah, the big question I think now is how long will this country be able to keep that number so high, and how long will it take before we'll see a month where well there will be jobs lost, and will that be maybe just before the elections or after, because that will have a huge impact.
I just wanted to ask you because I'm curious, because I see a lot of, the jobs are on the rise, but the inflation is also kind of not really where we want it to be. I go to the grocery
Right.
store and it hurts me. So I want to know if there is any positive signs in the near future, related to inflation here.
Well, I think that also has a lot to do with the fact that, well, if you look at, for example, if you go to a bar or you go to a supermarket, then usually you see a note on the front door saying, "Hey, help wanted." And that is a big story here, right? So there's not enough people to fill all those jobs. So these companies have to raise their wages to attract people, and well, that will cause inflation to rise. So I think these jobs are a large part of that inflation number, is at least what economists tell me.
So if we don't have more people to work, then the inflation is going to continue to rise.
Yes,
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you so much, Leonard, for your time and speaking with us and sharing your story. And I hope to
of
see you
course.
soon in DC. We're hosting, an event in December, and I hope to see you there.
Great. See you
Thank you
there.
so much. Have a great one. Bye.
Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.